First of all, I do have some sympathy, a lot of sympathy with universalism, and I think we have some of our most popular institutions have clearly a universalist basis. One thinks of the National Health Service and the BBC, and that's pretty powerful evidence in favour of it. I think we have to ensure that, understand how it works and what its appeal is. There is some kind of reciprocity, without which I think it's devalued. Even if it's just by virtue of being a citizen that you have an entitlement. It can sometimes that reciprocity is captured by the national insurance principle. And of course, a lot of the first half of the 20th century was it began with the contributory principle for health and pensions on a non-contributory basis, and 50 years was spent moving those two principles around, so we ended up with the National Health Service without a contributory principle and applying it to pensions instead. But the national insurance principle is an obvious way of capturing it. But there are other forms in which you can create some kind of reciprocity, an assumption that you're expected to work in return for benefits, for example. And I was just thinking about how it's an interesting contrast between our assumptions of citizenship and entitlement to the NHS, because I have seen in America healthcare systems just like the NHS with exactly the same issues of queuing and sometimes sadly poor quality service, and I saw it in the Indian healthcare system in the US and the veterans healthcare system in the US, and the kind of obligations that we think you have as a citizen in the UK accrue to people with rather more special circumstances in the US, like being a vet or a native Indian. And for me, I think the best way of capturing all this obligation is thinking of it as an intergenerational exchange, because a lot of these so-called universal rights we pay for during our peak earning years in middle age, and often we benefit from them when we have lower incomes, which is often when you're either a child or old. And when I was working on this in the Shadow Cabinet, part of my reform agenda was to try to push payments out to the extremities of the life cycle. Higher child benefits for under fives, higher pensions for over 80s. And that links to the other point I wanted to make, which is what is the alternative to universalism? And it's often described as means testing. And one of my frustrations in this debate is the way in which means testing and targeting are treated as synonymous. When Beveridge's great insight was that if you define categories of recipient of a program carefully enough, you can target without means testing. And I still think that remains a good principle of designing social policy, that try to identify categories of recipients so that you can target quite effectively. And again, that's why I think that age criteria can work as quite a good proxy, enabling you to target without a means test. But there are circumstances when you need a means test, and finally, so what kind of criteria would you apply on means testing? If the personal stories, if the circumstances that have led you to have a low income are also divergent, then probably means testing is the only way to do it, and that's certainly been the experience of successive governments with working age benefits. I remember years ago, so far deep into the past I can refer to this incident without in any way preempting current government policy. I remember Margaret Thatcher, when I was working for her, asking about whether we could why don't we means test child benefit? The call went out. And the issue you always face in those circumstances is what happens to the people in the middle. And someone says it's absurd that some Duchess collects child benefit, so you've got to means test it. If you means test it to avoid the Duchess collecting the child benefit, the game is simply not worth the candle. It's only worth means testing it to save money if you take people who don't regard themselves as rich and put them on the wrong side of your means test. And a lot of attempts at means test fall down at that point, the squeezed middle issue. I think that probably remains a continuing issue to this day. But what you can often do is tax it, and of course, that is a device which, in a way, George has used with child benefit, entering the higher rate of tax as a proxy to enable him to remove it. But you can include, you can count any benefits towards taxable income. None of this is a guide to future government policy. I have just given you some random reflections of my own on these important matters, and I hope that they might be relevant to what we're debating this evening. And sorry again about being late.